rest as much as I have been enjoying putting it together. Most of you here will know that over the last few weeks we have been building a biblical framework for rest. And actually, if you haven't seen any messages, the earlier messages, they're available on YouTube for you to have a look at. But I thought I'd start this morning by recapping our framework so far. And so the first point in that framework comes with some words which I think are a great reminder to us all. That first point in the framework is this: God worked for 6 days and then he rested. And as you will have heard me say, God rested. But Matt, my life's so busy, you don't understand, right? God rested. We see that, secondly, God blessed the Sabbath day, and then he made the seventh day holy. The Sabbath is not the same as a day off. The Sabbath is both a command and a gift. Note the command to remember the Sabbath. Then last week, or 2 weeks ago, we raised another 2 points, which not only were we to remember the Sabbath, but there's the command to observe the Sabbath. And then the Sabbath reminds us that we are image bearers of God, which is a huge countercultural statement. And we unpacked that last time. You may remember last time how I encouraged us all to move away from the need for more, to move away from the restlessness of the culture around us, to move towards the refreshment of reflecting and taking delight in God, taking delight in creation, taking delight in the world around us and our place in it. And if you want those things, having a Sabbath practice achieves these things. So we are image bearers of God. Now, this morning, we're going to add to that framework again. And in fact, this morning we will finish looking in the Old Testament and we will begin our journey into the New Testament, which we will wrap up next week. So if you could please turn in your Bibles to Leviticus chapter 23. And while you do that, I just want to mention that the book of Leviticus was written by Moses, and it's very much focused on the Old Testament priesthood. It was set in the time of Moses. It was to be a guide for the Israelites as they wandered through the wilderness and as they entered the promised land. Now, chapter 23, if you go through that chapter, you'll see that it sets out festivals. And the festivals themselves are an amazing thing to study. But it's interesting that not only do they have prophetic significance, but the very first one that's listed is the Sabbath. And that's what we're going to read about. Now, in the last time I pointed out that there had been a slight change around some of the things around the Sabbath between Exodus and Deuteronomy, for those of you that will remember that. Well, this morning here in Leviticus, there's another little change, and I'll read it and then we'll explain it. But the text says this in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. There are 6 days when you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. Now, if you think back to Exodus and Deuteronomy, in those spaces, there was nothing about a sacred assembly. In other words, what that means is a time of coming together as a people to worship God. But it's mentioned here because Leviticus focuses on the priesthood, right? They are the facilitators of the sacred assembly. So sacred assembly was actually part of their role. You are not to do any work wherever you live. It is a Sabbath to the Lord. So just a reminder, remember that Sabbath or Shabbat in Hebrew literally means to stop. It means to rest. It means to cease, to put an end to. It doesn't mean just to stop, it means to stop completely. Biblically, what it's saying is that we can't go about our week without taking time to rest. We can't go about our week without taking time to remember, to stop, to restore, and to reflect. Now, because of this, Shavuot was the top of the list, and it's probably the most important of all the appointed times. You'll note that it is the only one that happens every week, and it was the very first one that God gave to Moses, and it was the one that God himself demonstrated. And so the book of Leviticus reinforces this, and I'll say it again, undeniable importance of rest and renewal for God's people. Now, last time I talked about Sabbath rest not only being important for us as people, but also for us as the planet. And it's interesting that the next part that we'll look at is actually the command regarding the land. And so if you'd like to turn to Leviticus chapter 25, verse 4. It's interesting that a Sabbath rest for the land was also commanded in the Old Testament. And you go, what does that mean? It requires the land to rest from active agricultural production every seventh year. And so this text says this, Leviticus 25, verse 4. But in the seventh year, the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. It's interesting that this law allowed the land to rejuvenate. It allowed it to return vital nutrients to the soil, which enhances the quality of the produce. What's the outcome of that? It leads to healthier people and to healthier stock. So to put it another way, the people of Israel were allowed to work the land for 6 years, but on the seventh year they had to let the land rest. Now, by the way, the cool thing about this is I think this is one of the earliest records of a conservation principle. Right? We hear conservationists talking about the need to preserve the land and nature and the whole thing. And I would argue that this is probably one of the earliest ones on record. Now, if you think about it, this was risky, right? So for 6 years, you could plant your harvests, but on the seventh year, the law says, no, you're not allowed to plant any food. Do you see there's been a little bit of a risk involved there? Because the risk was that they had to trust God completely in that seventh year. I mean, it's all very well for us to say, yeah, we trust God. And if God said, yeah, every seventh year you're not allowed to go to the supermarket for a whole year. It just makes you think, doesn't it? Yeah. So it's important to remember in all of this that God's people were designated God's people because they had entered into a covenant with him. And at the heart of this agreement was the agreement to keep Sabbath, including, by inference, if you like, the Sabbaths of the land. And when they didn't keep it, they came under judgment because they broke the terms of the agreement. However, if they obeyed, time and time again, the scripture says that they would be a blessed people. But when you enter into a formal agreement with God, disobedience brings judgment. And this leads to the next part of our framework. The 9th point, and you go, oh my goodness, a 9-point sermon. No. Not keeping Sabbath will lead to disconnection from God. And then not keeping Sabbath leads to an imbalance in creation. So one of the things, you think about the world that we live in, and you think about our harvesting techniques, you think about the way that we, and I know this is probably strong language, but we have a history of raping and pillaging the planet. That was not God's intended plan. We were meant to be the caretakers of something incredibly precious. Now, I understand that in the early 1900s, what was the guy's name? Franz Haber, I think it was. He was the guy that came up with the formula for taking nitrogen from the air around us and turning it into fertilizer, effectively, for the land. And so that he effectively saved millions of lives. But like any man-made solution, the time that he did that coincided just before a world war. And what was the other side product of this process? Things explode. And so he also inadvertently gave birth to a bit of an arms race. And so it's that whole thing, isn't it? We try to come up with solutions for ourselves, but time and time again, when we step away from God's plan, we overcomplicate things. Now, we know that for about a 490-year period, Israel did not keep the Sabbaths. And this is one of the primary reasons that the prophets repeatedly told Israel that if you don't get your house in order, if you don't get back to the agreement that you had with God, then he will raise up a nation and they will take you away into captivity. And then, as time went on, the prophets became more specific. You will be away in captivity for 70 years, exactly. So why was the captivity in Babylon for 70 years? Because the sum of 70 years was the exact number of Sabbaths and Sabbaths for the land that Israel did not keep. And because Israel never kept the Sabbath for a 490-year period, God came debt collecting. God said to Israel through the prophets, hey guys, according to our agreement, our covenant, as my people, you owe me the sum of every Sabbath you have missed. And it worked out to be 70 years to the day. And so that's a cumulative effect of the Sabbaths in the week, the Sabbaths of the land, and the years of Jubilee. There were some other things on that, but it was 490 years. And so we now know that Israel went into captivity under King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon for 70 years to the day. And what happened to the land when the people were taken away? The land rested. And it's during that time, by the way, that we meet people like the prophet Daniel and the other prophet Ezekiel. Now, 490 years. What a very interesting number. Yeah, okay. Isn't it interesting in the New Testament that when Jesus said, or when Peter came to Jesus and asked, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister? 7 times? What does Jesus say? 7, hardly. Then he says, try 7 times 70. What is 7 times 70, all you mathematicians in the room? 490. I don't know, I just find numbers in the Bible very interesting. But anyway, for those of you that haven't clicked, 490 was equal to the number of years that God forgave Israel for not keeping the Sabbaths. And the number 490, by the way, comes up in the Bible numerous times, all to do with God's forgiveness, which is interesting. Now, for those of you that know the story of the captivity, after the Babylonian captivity is complete, Israel returns to Jerusalem in stages. And some of these names will be familiar to some of you, but there was a guy called Ezra, another guy called Nehemiah, another guy called Zerubbabel. Everyone say Zerubbabel. Man, I reckon that was put there because it's fun to say, Zerubbabel. But as a summary, Ezra helped set up the temple and the teachings. Zerubbabel, he brings back the items that were stolen from the temple. And Nehemiah leads the rebuilding of the city walls. Now, the big frustration for Nehemiah was this. As soon as Israel returns to Jerusalem after being in captivity for 70 years, they begin once again to break a number of God's laws. And guess which was the first one? The Sabbath. Actually, we'll take a look at this. If you want to turn in your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 15 to 22. And we'll read through this because it's interesting. So bear in mind the context is Israel has just returned after being in slavery for 70 years in captivity, and Nehemiah's led this amazing process on rebuilding the city walls, and then this is the observation that he makes. He says, in those days, this is verse 15, in those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all of this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. Verse 16, people from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. Now, the people of Tyre were probably one of the most materialistic peoples of the ancient world. They were known for their wealth, and they were known for their gods of wealth. They had an incredible shipping empire. And it's interesting that when the prophet Ezekiel talks about the origins of Satan, for those of you that know the text, he references a guy who's alive as the model of this, and it was the king of Tyre. So you've got, it's like Satan's kingdom himself, the representatives are the ones that have turned up at the gates and are starting to trade. In verse 17, I rebuked the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Now, who is he rebuking? It's the nobles of Israel. It's the wealthy elite of Israel. It's the wealthy who were making money on the Sabbath. Verse 18, didn't your ancestors do the same thing so that our God brought all this calamity upon us and on the city? That's a reality check. Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. He was quite serious, eh? Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and I said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you. Now, for Nehemiah, this was no hollow threat, because Nehemiah was not only the governor of Jerusalem, but he had the personal backing of the global world leader at the time, Artaxerxes. And so what happens is, this is a bit like today, someone turning up to try and set a house in order with the backing of someone like the President of the United States, for example, that kind of authority figure. Verse 21, from that time on they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. And then notice how Nehemiah ends with this with a prayer. He says, remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. And it always amazes me how this guy who's been part of the captivity for all of these years still recognizes God's love in all of this. So as the Old Testament wraps up, it kind of ends really with Israel again struggling to keep the Sabbath. We also see that not keeping the Sabbath had led to disconnection and imbalance. And one of the key driving factors for not keeping the Sabbath was the pursuit of making money. And it led to all sorts of injustice, as we talked about in part 3 of the series. Now, as we think about this today, there are implications for us. And the application for us is this, is we live in a society that is driven by those same values. We live in a society that is driven by the pursuit of material gain and wealth, and more often than not, at the expense of balance. Balance in the lives of people and balance in the lives of creation. Yeah, nothing new under the sun. So now, you go, oh my goodness, where are we going with this? Finally, we get to the New Testament. Everyone goes, yay, yay, fantastic. So if you'd like to turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 2. It's interesting that when we look in the New Testament and the way that Jesus himself engages with the Sabbath, we begin to see that Sabbath was far more than just keeping one day a week. It was a way of life. And Sabbath spirituality enhances our relationship with God, and it takes it to a deeper level. Jesus demonstrated this. One of the things he says about Sabbath is he says it is rest for your soul. Man, I want rest for my soul. This idea, of when people pass away, what do we often put on tombstones? R.I.P. Rest in peace. I don't want to wait till then to rest, right? I want to rest in peace every day in the way that God has designed us to do. But Sabbath becomes an anchor point of emotional health. It becomes an anchor point for spiritual formation. And keeping Sabbath does a deep work in us when we take it on as a lifestyle. And we're going to unpack that in the next, this week and next week. But anyway, Mark 2, 23 to 28. And in your Bibles, there might be a title which says, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. But in verse 23, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, because they were always on hand to watch. Now think about that. They were walking through fields, picking heads of grain. The Pharisees were watching. I find that very interesting. They weren't in the city or whatever. They were in the fields. But the Pharisees said to him, look, why are your followers doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Now, it's interesting because there is no law in the Torah about it being illegal to snack on the Sabbath. God is not anti-snack, right? He's not anti-snack. Isn't that cool? In fact, it's like his creation, snack, enjoy it, But in fact, all it says in the Torah, and we looked at this earlier in the series, it just says, remember the Sabbath day How? By keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh is the Sabbath to the Lord. On it you shall not do any work. Rather you should rest. So that's it. Now, so that's a strange thing for a Pharisee to say, unless you realize some of the background behind it. See, because by the time the New Testament rolled around and Jesus and his followers did this, I believe intentionally, by the way, because that's the thing about Jesus, he did so much intentionally to push buttons, and I think this pushed some buttons. But by the time the New Testament rolls around, there was a problem with this. And the problem was this. When you read the text, both work and rest have become a bit ambiguous. Work is often associated with physical exercise, right? So then, over time, if you think about it, the question arises, well, where does physical exercise start and stop? What about gardening? Is that physical exercise? What about things like cooking? Is that physical exercise? Or, if cooking's okay, then is it not okay to do the dishes? Right? I mean, I don't know how some of you feel about that, but so it came down, to physical exercise. Or, on the other hand, to take rest. Is exercise a form of rest or not? What about reading? No, I find reading life-giving. My wife constantly rebukes me about the library on the side of my bed, right? But I know others who couldn't think of anything worse. So I just want to say this. What I love about the ambiguity, and the more that I've thought about it, because you see, God is very clever, it turns out, by the way. But the ambiguity gives you the freedom for you to be you, right? That's it. You do you. Because I can't do you, you can't do me, you do you. And I think that's why it's set up like this. And when you look at, say, even the personality types in this room, I look around the room now, I see some who would be more rested up the top of a mountain and some who would be more rested sitting in a cafe. But then this ambiguity creates another problem. If we are to rest and not work on the Sabbath, then because of this ambiguity, what happens if we accidentally overstep the mark? And so the Pharisees, they put in by the way, people often forget that Jesus himself may have been a Pharisee. They go, what? Because they all get tarred with the bad brush. But actually, when you go through the text, I believe that Jesus probably identified with that group more than anything else. And this is why, when he's given them a hard time, you brood of vipers and all these other things, that actually those words had power, because it was like an internal critique, if you like. So, and by the way, historically the Pharisees, they started out well. Their line goes back to Ezra in the Old Testament, who returned from Babylon. He put the teachings of Israel back in place. And so originally the Pharisees were people with an amazing zeal for God. But you have to remember that when as a nation you return from captivity, you want to put things in place that you never want to go back there, right? You don't want to go back into captivity. And if not keeping the Sabbath was one of the reasons that they ended up in captivity, then what happens is the great minds of the day get together and they do what theologians call ring fence the Torah. Now, the way that I explain this, trying to understand this, it's a bit like in New Zealand when we go through these amazing bushwalks. We've got an amazing country, right? But how many times have you gone for a walk through the bush to go and see a waterfall or some other amazing feature, only to find that the Department of Conservation or some other group has put in a fence X amount away from the edge of the cliff? which, by the way, is not very good for Instagram photos, right? That's why people jump the fence and, they're out like this. But that whole idea is, I'm not mocking that, by the way, but the idea behind it is that there's a fence in place to keep people who have poor judgment behind the fence. That's the idea. Now, and often that fence is like 20 metres away from the edge, right? So sometimes you're there going, where is this waterfall? Because you can't see it from the path. But the reason that they set the fence back is just in case you are accidentally unwise and trip over, fall and hurt yourself. And so building a fence around the Torah was the same principle. In the text it says don't work, but rather rest. And because of their experience in captivity, the Pharisees stepped back and added hundreds of sub-clauses to the law. We're talking hundreds. There were about 613 sub-clauses to the law. Now note, God didn't do this. The religious leaders did. And so everything became overly prescribed. Everything from what food you could cook or not cook to how far you could walk. By the way, there's a term in the Bible that says about a Sabbath day's walk. Has anyone noticed that before? Yeah. I think I've worked it out, that I think a Sabbath day's walk in Kiwi speak would be between 400 and 500 metres. That's what I think a Sabbath day's walk is. The idea now, even within Jewish communities, that the idea is that they live within walking distance from the synagogue, a Sabbath day's walk, so they'd all go to the synagogue together. But isn't it interesting that this became legislation? And there was a point in the law in which a leisurely stroll on the Sabbath becomes work. It's about 500 metres. And I'd also say that for some of us it's way before that, right? But please note that the original intent was good. These rules came into effect after people came back from captivity because they did not want to go back into captivity again. But over the generations, the Pharisees lost the original intent, and what was originally intended to serve the people slowly became the very thing that shackled them. And the Pharisees then codified all these, and they were all collected in a series of writings called the Mishnah. And so Jesus, long story short, he's pro-Torah, but he's anti-Mishnah. And so the line here, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath is nothing to do with breaking the Torah or breaking Sabbath, because they weren't. What they were breaking was the Mishnah. The disciples were breaking the additional rules and regulations put in place not by God, but by the religious leaders. And so the way that Jesus goes about it, he's specifically pushing buttons. As I say, they're in the middle of a field and the Pharisees are watching, right? They've been watched. But in verse 25, the story goes on. It says, he answered, Jesus this was, have you never read? And I love that because that's a little bit of sarcasm by Jesus to a bunch of Bible experts, right? He answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. So Jesus is a Bible teacher speaking to other Bible teachers, and he's making his case based on a biblical citation. And Jesus was effectively saying, this is why what we're doing is okay. And then Jesus continues in verse 27. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And the word man could literally, in that context, be translated humanity. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, which is one of his titles, is Lord. In other words, he's the boss, even of the Sabbath. Now, this little 2-line phrase is one of Jesus' most important teachings on the Sabbath. Who has heard of that saying? The Sabbath was made for man, but not man for the Sabbath. Can I have a show of hands? Yeah, so a lot of us are familiar with that. We're going to put that into our framework, and so we'll just add those 2 points. Part 11, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, this phrase, by the way, can be a little bit tricky to translate from a 1st century Hebrew culture into a 21st century Kiwi culture. What Jesus was saying to his listeners when he said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, he was saying that the religious leaders had turned the Sabbath into a soul-sucking legislative nightmare. However, I would argue that most 21st century Wellingtonians need to hear the first part of the teaching. The Sabbath was made for humanity. It was designed, it was set in motion, it was tailor-fit for people, it was set in place for us, our humanity and our souls. But we have the exact opposite problem to the 1st century Jewish audience. It's not that we have all sorts of legalistic rules around the Sabbath in place. Our problem now is that we don't have any at all. Our society has absolutely no expectation around keeping a Sabbath. Most Kiwi don't even practice the Sabbath or don't even know that it's a thing. And for some of us, as previously mentioned, we confuse the Sabbath with a day off. And by the way, that's not to slam anyone. It's just what we do. So that's just to highlight the gap between the ancient world then and Wellington today. And this is why I argue that, you see, an arrow we have in our quiver is when you come to church, there should be 2 things, I believe, or 3 things that we are all enhanced by. First thing, obviously a deeper relationship with God. That goes without saying. Secondly, deeper relationships with each other. But often church forgets one of the most important things is that it should be about bringing rest and it should be about bringing life. And we live in a world that is hurting. We live in a world that is exhausted. We live in a world that runs at 100 miles an hour. And that's why I believe that one of our key arrows that we can fire in terms of one of our strengths should be the way in which we promote rest, that we promote taking a breath and trying to figure out how to incorporate that into a busy, crazy world. So in the busyness of urban life, amongst the noise, amongst the chaos, amongst the traffic, amongst the distraction of our phones in the digital age with alerts and text messages. If you think about Wellington, there's so much to do in Wellington that often when we get downtime, that's still 100 miles an hour because we want to go, I don't know, running up tracks or eating out or off to the movies or museums or whatever. And amongst all of that, we just need to recapture this practice. And the reason for that is that it's a gift. It's a gift from God to you that he personally demonstrated. So I'm going to ask the worship team to come forward. And as they do that, I just want to remind us, friends, that the Sabbath was meant to provide a rich well of refreshment for the people who practice it. And so my challenge for you this morning, there's a few actually, but once again, I want to ask you, are you practicing Sabbath now? And if you are you doing it in a way that brings you life? You may remember me making the observation last time that, isn't it interesting that within the 10 Commandments, the only spiritual practice that's listed is the one about keeping Sabbath. And you think, why is that? And that's simply because when we do keep Sabbath, then it invites us into every other spiritual practice. Because I don't know about you guys, but when I have rest and I want to be with God, what's the first thing I do? I pray. Oh, that's interesting. Then I like to read the Word. If I've ever thought about fasting, for example, that's another spiritual discipline. Often it's a lot easier to do that when you've got a day off without any obligations to anyone, right? But the Sabbath itself invites us into a deep place with God that I don't believe we can effectively do if we live a crazy, busy life. So when we keep a Sabbath, prayer becomes easier. It becomes deeper. When we keep a Sabbath, reading the Bible becomes easier. And I believe we go deeper. One of the key cool things about Sabbath is actually it's also an invitation to deeper relationships with each other. So, by way of finishing here this morning, I just want to re-speak these words over you. The words are these: God rested. If you are feeling anxious and weary this morning, just remember that God rested.